Y'all ready to be history?
Get started.
Welcome.
Hi.
Hello, everyone.
To the Pro Audio Suite, thanks to RØDE microphones.
These guys are professional. They're motivated.
Introducing Robert Marshall from Source Elements and Someone Audio Post, Chicago. Darren Robbo Robertson from Voodoo Radio Imaging, Sydney. Tech to the VO stars, George the Tech Whittam from LA. And me, Andrew Peters, voiceover talent and home studio guy.
Line up, ladies!
Here we go.
And welcome to another Pro Audio Suite. Don't forget our Patreon, patreon.com/proaudiosuite.com if you'd like to help us out. This week, we're talking about passive and active studio monitors. What are best? It's funny because, like, if you think about the 80s, you had Bob Claremountain with his NS10s. Hugh Padgham had some other passive speaker. I can't remember what it was. But anyway, everyone in the 80s seemed to use passive speakers. Was that because there were no powered speakers, active ones? I have no idea.
Genelec was, I think, the first one that really broke powered speakers. Them and the Meyer HD1s were some of that I remember at least, the first powered speakers. And the big deal there was that they were bi-amped as well. I don't think it was such a big deal that you had a shorter path of the power to the speaker.
Just a different crossover design. The crossover is
It's not at the
before
power level.
amplifiers,
Right.
and you can design a more, I don't know, whatever. You can fine tune it. Yeah, you can really fine tune it, and then you can control exactly how much power goes to each driver.
I think also you didn't need as big capacitors because you weren't dealing with power. You were just like line level, so the crossover could be smaller. And but powered speakers sound great. For many are extremely convenient, right? You just plug in your XLR, so you just need two cables. You don't need another box in between.
For sure, they're convenient.
Yeah,
For sure.
But what about sound quality?
at least as good. Really, I don't think it makes a difference. You can have a amazing pair of powered speakers, and you can have an amazing pair of passive speakers.
Right.
They each have an amp, and they each have drivers, and that's what's going to make them sound good or bad. So I don't think that being
It's hard to say.
powered makes them better sound-wise. It makes them convenient and smart and a lot of other things.
Simpler.
Just recently, as you would know, I went from the Dynaudio BM6s, which were passive, and I had an amp in the room, to the Atom Audios, the A7Xs. And look, I love the Atom's Audios. I would never trade them in, but I could equally say that about the Dynaudios as well. I really liked those. I think I just like the thing I like more about the Atoms is sort of, especially for me, the stereo separation and all that sort of stuff that seems to be a lot
Because the tweeters are kind of like ribbons.
yeah, because
like
the ribbon tweeters. But I mean, I equally liked both. My preference would be the Atoms, but Jesus, they were both great sets of monitors.
So do you feel like some level, because you're like, I like the Atoms more than or they're different, but do you think any level of that isn't necessarily the brand, just the bi-amping versus single amping?
Yeah, look, it was interesting because I was saying, Andrew and I were talking about this yesterday, and I was saying you can't really draw a comparison because, the Atoms have the ribbon tweeters, whereas, the Dynaudios were just two cones. But yeah, I think for me, especially doing radio imaging, the biggest thing is that stereo separation, which is much more clearer and 90% certain that comes from the ribbon tweeters.
Right,
So
which is not a active versus passive speaker
That's right. You could
issue.
have it for either. That's right. Exactly.
Yep.
So, I think that's more a speaker thing than an actual active versus passive thing. And that's sort of probably what I was trying to say was, I could easily do my work using both.
The comparison that would actually give us a better idea of what's better is the new Chris Lord Alge speakers that he's done with Aventone, what they call CLA 10s, where he's made a copy of the NS10, but he has the passive and active versions of those. So it'd be interesting to hear the difference between those two speakers.
I think there's something to be said for passive speakers. If you think about it, no one's going on tour with active speakers. They're running amp racks. And so on a massive scale, there's reasons to run passive speakers. And I think also sometimes when you think about it, it is actually easier to wire up a place with passive speakers than active speakers.
Oh yeah,
Kind of,
absolutely. I was
know?
always looking for
Yeah.
somewhere to hide the amp when I had the passive monitors in the room, especially once I started podcasting and was needing to record out of the room. That was always a nightmare.
Yeah.
Mhm. But what about the cost difference? So the active speakers are inevitably more expensive, though.
They
Yeah.
are, aren't they? That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
So I think it's about like another 45, 50% more expensive.
Right.
I'm talking about the CLA 10s. That's
So
kind of the
that would
price
be an
difference.
advantage to a passive speaker if that's something that, you look at, there are some amazing passive speakers like the Pro-Ax or the Pro AC. I think they're referred to as Pro-Ax. Those sound great. They're small. They're passive. I don't know that they make an active pair of Pro-Ax, actually. I don't think they do.
Yeah, but they may be cheaper, the speakers, but you've got to buy yourself a decent amp to drive them. So,
Well, and also I guess the opposite to that is with the actives is that you haven't got an amp fan running and all that sort of stuff in the room. So if that's where you've got
Most
to put it.
amps are air cooled.
Well,
I mean, a lot of amps
studio amps are, but not
Yeah.
live amps.
Yeah.
Those live
Right.
amplifiers are now putting out 3,000 to 5,000 watts per rack
Yeah,
space.
so they're running fans, but not. I mean, I don't see, for instance, a theater running with you don't see them wiring up with active speakers, and the reason why is because at some point active speakers become inconvenient compared to passive speakers because. If it's all up on the desk stereo, it's easy to get power to them. But as soon as you have to start distributing speakers throughout the room and getting them to mount nicely, having to locate power everywhere or one running not just two audio lines, but power also, that becomes a liability in a sense to the ease of setup and things like that. So
Also the weight. I mean, I've got those Yamaha MSP10s, MSP10 Studios that came up after the NS10, and they weighed 25 kilos each.
That's pretty heavy.
It's bloody heavy. When you're moving them, it's a backbreaker.
Yeah.
That's a child or a big dog.
Yeah.
Or in my case, not quite as fat and hairy as my dog.
Well, amplifiers have gotten lighter weight as they've gone to what they call Class D, and Class D digital amps are way lighter weight, like per watt. So that's what's all the touring systems are using now, and it's made their rack systems so much lighter. I know there are active touring systems that are powered. I mean, it's such a preference. I can say for a home user, like a desktop or a small mid-field monitor, another advantage of powered speakers is they can protect themselves from destruction really effectively because they have detection circuits and feedback networks that monitor the output of the speaker to make sure that you're not clipping the amp. They have all kinds of protection, and it's.
But you can
very
always
hard
just throw a fuse into a speaker line and pretty much got it protected.
Yeah, I mean, but these do it dynamically, like ongoingly. It's just like if you do something dumb, like my Mackie HR824 is right here on my desk. They have an overload light, and when you really hammer them, if you see that overload light comes on, okay, back it down a little bit, buddy. You're clipping. You're getting on the edge of clipping. You know.
Yeah.
Right. Well, the advantage of the active speakers is that the manufacturer can make the exact amplifier that is needed for the speaker.
Impedance matches.
It's a great
exactly.
pairing, of course. And
Perfect impedance matching, perfect crossover design. They can optimize the living heck out of it. And in the case of my HR824s, they can package everything in a very compact way. Like these even have a passive radiator on the back. Huge oval-shaped passive radiator that's actually completely hidden behind the amplifier. You won't even know it's there, but it makes these speakers like ruler flat down to like 30, I think it's 38 hertz, something like that. They slam. Like for large-ish bookshelf speakers, they're 8-inch drivers. They have an unbelievable amount of output, more than I could ever use in my apartment. That's for sure.
Well, without being arrested, yeah.
without the neighbors getting really pissed at me.
Or without the neighbors robbing your garage because you're annoying them.
Do you know what's funny is the style of active speaker, which is where they stick the amp in one of the two speakers, and then they make you run a passive line from one speaker to the other. For
usually cheapy ones. Those are usually the lower end ones.
It's like, what is this? Is this active or it's both?
Yeah, it's a good question. If you buy like the $100 monitor speakers, like a pair of monitors, like Mackie or.
There are actually some okay ones. Even M Audio had some somewhat decent like desktop. Like they're usually like 4-inch monitors. They're very they're very desktopy.
I'm really happy with the stuff from Presonus they're doing, the Iris brand. Even at the really low end, the $100 ones that are like that, one's the amp and one's passive, they still sound surprisingly good. And if you go a little bit more pricey into the higher level, ERS, I think this ERIS 4.5s or the 5s, damn good sounding speakers for, under $300 a pair. Those have been the ones I've been recommending more so lately. And, as long as they last, so many people with M Audios, the amplifiers started going bad and buzzing and losing drivers and stuff. So time will tell. That's the thing.
It's funny because the little Genelecs I've got, the 8010s, from memory, I think they've got 2 amps per speaker. So
that's what the bi-amping is.
Yeah.
Each driver has a dedicated amplifier, and there's a crossover that's deciding what frequencies go to one amp and what goes to the other amp. And
if you have a really fancy pair of passive speakers, it will give you terminals for powering the tweeters or even the mid-range. They might be 3-way separately from the bass. And then usually there's a bracket that binds them together because not many people have an external crossover. Right. Because then you're getting the same thing as the active speakers, a line level crossover.
That's audiophile, basically audiophile stuff, where they even have external crossover networks and stuff that they use, and they really go crazy with. They want to control absolutely every aspect of what's going on.
The direction of the cable,
So the question is, what's the most popular in commercial studios and
powered
projects? Powered.
Oh, yeah. I think passive speakers you're running passive speakers mainly when you're trying to run a classic pair of Oratones or, NS10s, maybe some, Pro-Ax. There are some high-end speakers. Like a lot of mastering facilities are all running passive speakers, and they're amplifying externally usually. Yeah. But that's because they tend to start using kind of super high audiophile prosumer, like not consumer, but just like crazy. Yeah. So it goes full circle, right? The super high end is passive, the super low end is passive, and in the middle on up to the high end is active speakers.
Yeah. It's kind of funny. And I was looking at the Genelec specs. The Genelec 8010s have a 25 watt amp, and these are Class D digital amps, a 25 watt bass amp and 25 watts treble amp. So they have the ability to drive the same amount of power to each of the drivers, which is interesting because you wouldn't think a treble driver would need as much juice as a bass driver. But I guess they decided, for maximum accuracy, the lowest amount of distortion, that's the key. And that was always the key classically to avoid distortion, was to use far more power than you actually use. Right. It's like you want a 300 per channel amp monoblock, and you're going to use 20 or 30 of it, like 95% of the time, until you hit this huge.
And it's also transient. Very important with speakers to look at with amps to look at their RMS capacity versus their peak capacity. Yeah, they give you those two specs sometimes because the peak amplitude, power rating is more impressive usually. Yep. It's a much higher number. Yeah. It's really the RMS number that you're most concerned about. The RMS is truly the loudness that you would perceive as are they loud or not. That's the average. The sustained output that it can put out over time.
We'll see, back in the good old days when you buy a hi-fi, we used to quote the RMS figure. People always want to know, what's the RMS on this thing per channel?
Yeah, and then in the 80s, it became the peak.
Yes, I was going to say, you were on the same page. Like if you bought a boombox in the 80s, it would have a sticker on it that says 300 watts per channel, and then it would say a little label, peak power per it's like, blah, blah, blah.
Is that horsepower at the crank or at the wheel?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. What do you really actually use versus what's a good number? Whatever sells it,
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
What do you have? You have the 8010s. Robert, what are your daily drivers these days?
So I have a pair of Genelec 1030s on the near fields. Also have NS10s, but it's usually one or the other. And then on the midfield, I've got Meyer HD1s. So those are both powered speakers. And then I've got some other passive speakers, or the Genelecs and the Meyers are powered. The NS10s are not powered; those are passive. I've got a bunch of like different, B&W and some other speakers that I use. So everything else is passive. Those are my only powered speakers I have. And then at the other studio, we have 1031s. Which one thing I appreciate about Genelec, especially my experience with the 10 series from the 1029s all the way up to like the 1032s and even bigger speakers, they always sound very consistent.
Yeah.
And they just get louder and the bass goes lower.
Right.
But everything else seems to be very much the same in the way they present their soundstage.
The voicing
really
is
great.
the same no matter what. They're super, super.
Well, I think what happened with Yamaha after the NS10s, when they moved to the MSP10, which is the ones I've got here, the MSP10 and MSP10 Studio powered speakers, they're huge. And I think they were doing the Genelec thing with their speakers. And like everybody, the Sound on Sound reviews love them. Everybody loved them, but they just didn't sell. And I kind of guessed that Genelec just owned that territory and they couldn't get in.
Well, everyone went chasing after the Genelecs. Like, weren't the event, which is now RØDE, the 2020s, were marketed as like basically Genelec clones. And they actually were my first pair of speakers. I actually had a passive pair of them, and they got the job done really well. I think that there's like real subtleties in there especially in the high end, but they're passive speakers. They had very much, I thought, a behavior similar to the Genelecs once I, began using Genelecs. So,
and for whatever reason, when I got my first monitors, I went with the Mackeys. I think they were similar in output and design to the Genelec 1031s, but just a lot less expensive. Like,
and they also were kind of marketed as like, look at how they look.
Yeah.
They just look, they try to look like Genelecs.
The waveguide is really similar to what the 1031s use. It's just they were, even when I bought them new in 98, they were about, I think I remember they were like $600 a piece. So they weren't cheap.
Right.
In 1998.
But even at that time, they were probably, I bet, half the price of the Genelecs.
Yeah. I think so. I don't know.
Genelecs are definitely not cheap.
No. Even the little baby, the 3-inch ones, the ones that Andrew has are 350
that are
US
not bi-amp.
each. Each.
Yeah.
No, they are bi-amp. They have 2 amps per.
The little small ones?
The 810 has a 25
the 6000 series, I think, is not bi-amped.
Oh, maybe, yeah. No, the 8010, that little tiny 8010 with a 3-inch driver has a 25-watt bass and a 25-watt treble digital amp. And it goes down to 67, which 67 is enough to get a little bit of a kick drum. You're not going to get the thump, but you can really,
you can get a feel for it. Yeah, it's not like, it's not all the way down, but what can you expect?
Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
Unless you're Bose and you start running tubes everywhere.
Right. There are some pretty impressive ones from, of all companies, you wouldn't think, but IK Multimedia.
Yeah,
I've
seen those ones, those skinny tall ones.
Sized, they're really tiny.
Yep.
But they can put out down to like 50 hertz or something like that. They're pretty amazing low end on them. Like, it's kind of shocking. And they're really tiny.
That's like those ProAx. Those ProAx have amazing low end, and they're just like kind of bookshelf, like I think 6-inch, not even 10-inch drivers, and they just they're ported, and they just have that tuning just right. And they and usually on those speakers, I don't know if you remember the Boston Acoustic speakers, the first ones that started using like a metal surrounding, and then there's the pair of, what were they? The Radio Shack. Do you ever use the Minima 7s, I think. Yeah. Hold on one second.
Yeah.
Sage, not now.
Where's your recording on the air light?
Yeah. I need
that's right. You need one of those. Absolutely.
But so the Radio Shack Minima 7s, which I think were copies of the Boston Acoustics, and you'd see these little 4-inch speakers, and you get a ton of bass out of them. And then you look at them, and that little driver is flying all over the place. Like the excursion is, I mean, they're moving like at least an inch forward and back. Like they almost have like a 2-inch throw, and it's still about moving air in the end, you know?
Moving air, but still controlling that motion so that they don't distort. That's where they have a lot of trouble. The more excursion,
the more time it takes to get back.
Right. And that means you need more powerful magnet structures.
Right.
You know, it takes a lot of science in there to get all that to not distort, but yeah, it's
right. But when you look at like an 18-inch speaker, sometimes you see how much like air is coming out of it, and the speaker barely moves like a 1/4 inch. And it's just like
right. Yeah,
that's because it's got all that surface area to move the air instead of like a the distance, you know.
Well, I'm glad to have my Mackies back, even if I hardly get to use them. But they're not mine. I actually traded them a client. A client had these, and they're like, I never ever use them, and they're huge. I want to get rid of them, and so I traded for those little tiny IK multimedia speakers, those little baby ones. And I got these. And so now I have the ones that I used to have in my recording remote truck back in 1998 back on my desk again. And it's kind of fun. It's neat. It's neat to have those old speakers back.
A bit of nostalgia.
It is nostalgic. Yeah. And they still sound darn good. I mean, they've done a couple maybe additions since then, some updates, but they still sound great. I know there's people that still use these. And it's like headphones. Once you tune your hearing in your studio, once you know a speaker, like the NS10s, there's people that are still going to swear by those 30 years later.
Or even, I love NS10s, and I love mixing music on NS10s, and I still like to mix commercials more on Genelecs.
Yeah.
Because I find that the speakers kind of steer you a little bit one way or the other.
Right.
And it's funny, but get to know your speakers, because frequencies don't go out of fashion. They're
exactly
right.
It's all the same stuff.
Exactly.
Know your speakers, know your room, and know when they're not accurate. I'll say the very last thing that I know about active speakers is Genelec has active speakers with onboard measurement.
That's right.
You plug in a microphone, and the speakers calibrate themselves to your environment. And that's really where
sometimes doing like full up frequency sweeps.
Yeah.
That's a whole nother level.
Yeah, they do that.
You can get external systems that do that, but like the Trinove. Have you ever heard of that system?
No.
Oh, it's amazing. It has like 3 microphones, and it measures not just the frequency sweeps, but it figures out delays, and it tunes the whole room. It's a surround thing, and and it takes a tiny pair of speakers and makes them sound like huge.
That's great. That's so cool. JBL had a little monitor controller that I installed one time, just for volume control, switching speakers, but it had a measurement mic, and it ran an application on a Windows PC. You had to use Windows to run the app, but it did just that too. And you could plug any monitors into it, and it would calibrate. It's pretty cool.
I had still have actually, a pair of speakers from Iowa, from an 80s looking. It had the drivers were square, even though they definitely were a coil magnet underneath there. But all the drivers were square, so that they could time align everything. It was all on a flat plane. Was the first thing they did. But it had a microphone hanging right in front of the woofer, and it had built into this stereo system like an active management of itself.
Wow,
that's cool.
You just push a button on, and it kind of adjust the bass and get a little bit tighter.
Wow, that's very clever.
Yeah. Who's still awake? No, sorry.
That was truly geeky.
Well, that was good, though, because 1960s, there you go.
Yeah.
Who would have thought? Who would have thunk it?
Even before Robbo.
Even before me. That's right. Exactly.
In fact, I think before all of you, except me.
That is the era known as pre-Robbo. Exactly. Yeah.
So we could say that Andrew predates powered speakers.
I do.
Yes.
Let me get back to that Google page. Here's our ignorance being exposed, or my ignorance.
Yes, we Google.
Yes.
So my first experience with active monitors, I said, was Genelec and Meyer, and I think that those companies in the pro audio studio world did break the concept and really marketed it well, and those are the first popular ones. But here it says some of the first powered loudspeakers were JBL monitor speakers with the addition of the SE401 stereo energizer, introduced in 1964.
Boom.
Is that where the Energizer Bunny came from?
No, I don't think so. Didn't have bunnies back then. It would have been small dinosaurs.
And did
probably.
it say that the power was internal, or was it like a dedicated
let me click into the article, and it says history, SE41. The first studio monitor with the active crossover was the CY, invented in 1967 by Klein and Hummel. It was a hybrid three-way design with two internal amplifier channels. Early examples of biamping power studio monitors is the Altec 98468B, introduced in 1971, combined with the passive A speaker, triple amp, 60 watts. Let's see if this article says anything about Genelec. I'm going to search this article for Genelec.
Well, I saw that the Genelec 1030As came out in 94. So that's pretty early in the evolution for like studio power monitors.
but okay, Genelec, GENEL.
Was there a 1031?
It's not even mentioned in this article. Powered speakers is the name of the Wikipedia article, and Genelec
Isn't in the Wikipedia?
is not in there.
That's fascinating.
Wow.
Because they're definitely synonymous to me as well with powered monitors. When I was at Virginia Tech and working in the studio, we had the very earliest, I think they were the 1030s. Were they the very first ones that came out?
Yeah, so
94?
here it is. They do mention Meyer in this article.
Yeah.
And they say, in 1980, Meyer Sound Laboratories produced the integrated active two-way system, the passive UPA-1, which was incorporated into the M3, whichever that one was. And then it's the integrated crossover, feedback, this and that, and all the design. In 1990, Meyer produced the first powered speaker, the HD-1. So, but that's its first powered speaker. JBL was doing this in the 60s.
Yeah.
Wow.
Before them, according to this. It is really interesting to me that Genelec does not have a place in this particular article.
That's weird.
Because, I agree. Genelec is synonymous with powered speakers.
I wonder if JBL continuously developed and produced powered speakers all the way through the 60s, 70s, and 80s, or if it was like a sort of an engineering exercise, try it out, make it, see if it works, but it was too, whatever, heavy, expensive, whatever, and then they stopped making them for a while. I wonder,
Yeah, I mean, maybe part of the breaking of the market, in a sense, was when the amplifiers got smaller, and that was starting in the 80s and 90s, switching power supplies and things like that made it possible to put it into the speaker. Because as we all know, active speakers are heavy.
Yeah. And power supplies are heavy. That's another thing that's gotten modernized is power supplies. They've become far, far lighter weight and more compact. I mean, look at the charger for your MacBook, how much smaller it is now than it was, 10 years ago. It keeps shrinking.
Yeah.
And it's not that it's putting out less power. It's just...
But it puts it out in different ways. It's a switching power supply instead of like a continuous current.
Right.
And that's how they get it smaller, because I think it's playing on AC, somehow making it DC, but it's like in pulses. It's not like a continuous. But yeah, it's true. And most equipment is perfectly happy with that. And if you filter it well, power is power.
Yeah.
Well, there you go. Active or passive? This is the question.
Exactly.
And you did not get an answer.
No.
You never will.
Well, we got a discussion. We're never going to tell you black or white, yes or no.
Make up your own mind.
For each his own.
What do you talk about? You talk about commitment here? Get out of I'm not doing that.
Yeah, open a can of worms if you start doing that.
Well, that was fun. Is it over?
The Pro Audio Suite recorded using Rode NTG5s and Source Connect. Edited by Andrew Peters and mixed by Voodoo Radio Imaging. With tech support from George the Tech Witter. Help us share the show with more people and get your hands on exclusive content by contributing to our Patreon page. See patreon.com/Pro Audio Suite. Don't forget to subscribe to the show and join in the conversation on our Facebook group. To leave a comment, suggest a topic, or just say g'day, drop us a note at our website, proaudiosuite.com.